The tribunal chamber fell silent as the doors opened. 12 species had sent their most important diplomats to the neutral station called Verath Prime. They sat in a wide circle, their different bodies and faces all turned toward the entrance. They had come to hear testimony about the war between humanity and the Zorvathi Empire. They expected facts and numbers. They did not expect what walked through those doors. Kethral Vaughn moved slowly across the polished floor. He was a Selvian, and his kind were known throughout the galaxy for one thing above all else. They did not feel fear. They did not show emotion. Their minds worked like machines, cold and perfect. The Selvian people had observed 100 wars across 1,000 years. They recorded everything and felt nothing. But something was wrong with Kethral. His forearms hung limp at his sides. His gray skin had turned pale, almost white. His large eyes, usually steady and calm, moved constantly around the room as if searching for danger. When he reached the center of the chamber and sat in the witness chair, his hands would not stop shaking. Ambassador Tyrus, a massive creature covered in blue scales, leaned forward from his elevated seat. He was the presiding official of this tribunal, chosen for his fairness and his age. He had seen much in his long life. He had never seen a Selvian look afraid. Kethral Vaughn, Tyrus said in a deep voice. You were sent by the Selvian Council to observe the conflict between the human species and the Zorvathi Empire. Is this correct? Yes, Kethral answered. His voice cracked on that single word. You were embedded with human military forces for 67 standard cycles. You witnessed their methods of war firsthand. The Council has asked you to share your observations with this assembly. Tyrus paused and studied the broken creature before him. Are you prepared to give your testimony? Kethral was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at his trembling hands. Then he looked up at the gathered diplomats, and something terrible moved behind his eyes. I am prepared, he said. But I must warn this assembly. What I am about to tell you will change how you see the galaxy. It changed me. It broke me. And I was only watching. Whispers spread through the chamber. The Korthani delegate, a being made of living crystal, made a sound like wind chimes in a storm. The Velish ambassador wrapped her tentacles tighter around herself. Even the Zorvathi representative, a scarred warrior named Cresses Van, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. In the corner of the room, a human officer stood with his arms crossed. Commander Sam Harris had been sent to observe this testimony on behalf of Earth. He was tall and broad, with gray hair cut short and a face that showed nothing. He watched Kethral with calm, patient eyes. Begin your account, Tyrus ordered. Kethral took a breath that shuddered through his thin body. When my team was first assigned to this mission, we believed we knew what we would find. The humans were a young species. They had only been traveling between stars for 200 years. Their technology was average. Their military was small. The Zorvathi Empire had conquered 60 worlds and destroyed 3 civilizations. Every calculation told us the same thing. He paused. We expected to document a quick defeat. We expected to watch humanity die. He laughed then, but there was no humor in the sound. It was the laugh of someone who had seen something that broke their understanding of reality. We were fools, he continued. We looked at their ships and their weapons and their numbers, and we thought we understood them. We measured them by the standards we use for every species, but humans cannot be measured. They cannot be calculated. They are something else entirely. Kethral stood from his chair and walked to the center of the chamber. He moved like an old man, though his species lived for centuries, and he was still young. I will tell you what I saw. I will tell you about the siege of Carrion IV, where a handful of soldiers held a canyon against 40,000 enemy troops for 9 days. I will tell you about their doctors, who healed wounded enemies, while their own people died around them. I will tell you about the Battle of the Kessler Nebula, where human captains chose death so that strangers could live. He turned in a slow circle, meeting the eyes of every delegate. But first, I will tell you about my arrival. I will tell you about the moment I first understood that everything I believed about war was wrong. The chamber was completely silent now. Not even the mechanical hum of the station's systems could be heard. I came aboard the human carrier vessel called the Defiant Hope. It was a large ship, but crude by galactic standards. The corridors were narrow. The lighting was harsh. The air smelled of metal and sweat and something else I could not identify. He closed his eyes as the memory took him. I was met by Admiral Laura Kent. She was a small woman with silver hair and eyes the color of winter ice. The humans have a rank structure in their military, and she was near the top. She commanded 40,000 soldiers and 200 ships. When I met her, she was eating a meal in the common area with her lowest-ranking crew members. She was laughing at a joke one of them had told. Kethral opened his eyes. I had studied human behavior before my mission. I knew they had unusual social customs, but I did not understand what I was seeing until much later. Their leaders do not separate themselves from their soldiers. They eat together, they suffer together, they die together. This seems like a small thing, but it is not. It is the foundation of everything they are. He returned to his seat and gripped the armrests with all four hands. Admiral Kent welcomed me aboard. She assigned me to a unit that was being sent to the surface of Carrion IV. She told me I would see real war, not the clean kind fought by machines and computers. She told me I would see what humans were capable of when they had something to protect. Kethral looked directly at Commander Harris, who had not moved or changed expression. She was right, the Selvian said quietly. I saw what humans are capable of, and I have not slept without nightmares since. Ambassador Tyrus cleared his throat. Continue your testimony, observer. Tell us about Carrion IV. Well, Kethral nodded slowly. His shaking had gotten worse, but his voice grew stronger. He had carried this burden for too long. Now he would share it with the galaxy. Very well, he said. Let me tell you about the canyon. Let me tell you about Sergeant Danny Cole and his soldiers. Let me tell you about the 9 longest days in my life. He began to speak, and the tribunal listened in growing horror to tales of human endurance that should have been impossible. Kethral closed his eyes and let the memories take him back. The tribunal chamber faded away, and he was standing once again on the red dirt of Carrion IV, surrounded by the sounds of war. The colony had a population of 300,000 civilians, he told the assembly. When the Zorvathi fleet arrived, they began landing troops immediately. The humans had only one objective: get the civilians to the evacuation ships. The problem was simple. There was only one path from the colony to the landing zone, and it ran through a narrow canyon called Miller's Pass. He opened his eyes and looked at the gathered diplomats. The Zorvathi sent 40,000 soldiers to take that canyon. The humans sent 93. The Korthani delegate made a sound of disbelief. 93 soldiers against 40,000? That is not a battle. That is a slaughter. That is what I thought, Kethral agreed. I was wrong. He stood and began to pace, his forearms moving restlessly. I was assigned to the unit of Sergeant Danny Cole. He was not a remarkable man by human standards. He was 34 years old. He had brown hair and brown eyes and a face that looked tired. He had been a soldier for 12 years. He had a wife and 2 daughters on a colony 3 systems away. Kethral stopped pacing. When he learned that his unit would be defending the canyon, do you know what he did? He gathered his soldiers together. He told them exactly how many enemies they would face. He told them that relief forces would not arrive for at least 10 days. He told them that most of them would probably die. The Selvian's voice grew quiet. Then he asked if anyone wanted to volunteer for the evacuation teams instead. No one would have blamed them. It was a reasonable choice. A logical choice. He paused. Not a single soldier stepped forward. Not one. Ambassador Tyrus shifted in his seat. Perhaps they feared punishment for showing weakness. No, Kethral said firmly. You do not understand. I watched their faces. I saw their eyes. They were afraid. They knew they were going to die. But they would not leave. They could not leave. There were 300,000 civilians behind them, and those civilians needed time to escape. He returned to his chair but did not sit. The canyon was 300 meters wide at its narrowest point. The walls were steep and made of solid rock. Sergeant Cole positioned his soldiers along the high ground on both sides. They built barriers from rocks and broken vehicles. They set up their weapons and they waited. Kethral gripped the back of his chair. The first wave came at dawn. 5,000 Zorvathi troops, supported by armored vehicles. They expected to sweep through the canyon in an hour. They did not make it 50 meters. He looked at the Zorvathi ambassador, Cresses Van, who sat perfectly still. Your people are excellent warriors, ambassador, strong, fast, and brave. But you had never fought humans before. You did not know what they could do. Cresses Van said nothing. His scarred face revealed no emotion. The humans held that first wave for 6 hours. When it was over, the canyon floor was covered with the bodies of the fallen. The humans had lost 11 soldiers. 11 out of 93. They did not retreat. They did not ask for help. They reloaded their weapons and waited for the next wave. Kethral finally sat down. His body seemed to collapse into the chair. For 9 days, this continued. Wave after wave of Zorvathi troops. The humans fought without rest. They used stimulants to stay awake, rotating unconscious soldiers to the back lines. When a soldier fell asleep at their post, their companions would prop them up and keep firing their weapon for them. He looked at his shaking hands. I watched a woman named Corporal Megan Price take a piece of metal shrapnel through her stomach. Do you know what she did? She sat down behind a rock, opened her medical kit, and performed surgery on herself. She removed the metal, sealed the wound with chemical foam, and injected herself with pain blockers. Then she stood up and went back to treating other wounded soldiers. She did not stop working for another 4 days. The chamber was silent except for the soft breathing of the delegates. There was a young man named Jake Torres. He was 19 years old. It was his first deployment. On the 7th day, the Zorvathi brought up a communications array that was jamming human signals. Without communications, the evacuation ships could not coordinate their departures. Kethral's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. Private Torres volunteered to destroy it. Everyone knew it was a death mission. The array was behind enemy lines, surrounded by thousands of troops. Sergeant Cole told him no. He said they would find another way. The Selvian looked up at the assembly. That night, Torres left the canyon alone. He crawled through enemy territory for 8 hours. He reached the array and destroyed it with explosives he had carried on his back. The blast caught him in the open. It broke both his legs and burned half his body. Kethral's voice cracked. He crawled back. For 12 hours, with 2 broken legs, through enemy patrols and debris fields, he crawled back to the canyon. When the morning watch found him, he was still alive. Barely. His first words were to ask if the communications were working again. Tears were running down the Selvian's face now. His species was not supposed to cry. They did not have the biological mechanisms for it. But somehow, Kethral wept. On the 9th day, relief forces finally arrived. The evacuation was complete. 297,000 civilians had escaped. Of the 93 soldiers who had defended the canyon, 23 were still alive. 23. He wiped his face with trembling hands. Sergeant Cole was one of them. When the relief commander tried to praise him, do you know what he said? He said he was sorry. He apologized for losing 70 soldiers. He wept for the ones he could not save. He did not celebrate surviving. He mourned the ones who did not. Kethral stood one final time and faced the assembly. I asked Sergeant Cole how they did it. How did 93 soldiers hold against 40,000 for 9 days? How did they keep fighting when their bodies failed and their friends died around them? He spread his forearms wide. He looked at me with those tired brown eyes, and he said something I will never forget. He said, when you have something worth dying for, dying becomes easy. Living with failure is the hard part. Kethral let his arms fall to his sides. The humans do not fight like other species. They do not calculate odds or measure resources. They fight with something else. Something I do not have a word for. Something that makes them more than the sum of their parts. He looked at Commander Harris, who still stood silently in the corner. They call it heart, Kethral said. I call it terrifying. Ambassador Tyrus took a long moment to compose himself. "This is difficult to believe," he finally said. "The numbers you describe, the feats of endurance, they seem impossible." "I have recordings," Kethral replied. "I have medical data, combat footage, and after-action reports. Everything I have told you can be verified. But the numbers do not capture the truth. The truth is that humans should not be able to do what they do. And yet they do it anyway." Kethral took a long drink of water before continuing. His throat was dry, and the memories he was about to share weighed heavily on his mind. The tribunal waited in patient silence. "After the siege of Carrion 4, I was transferred to a different assignment. The humans had captured a Zorvathi medical facility on a moon called Vega 7. They converted it into a field hospital for their own wounded. I was sent to observe their medical practices." He set down his water and folded all four hands in his lap. "What I saw there was the beginning of my confusion, the beginning of what I can only call the madness." The Velish ambassador leaned forward, her tentacles curling with interest. "Madness? What do you mean?" Kethral looked directly at the Zorvathi ambassador, Cress Van. "Your people had wounded soldiers at that facility, 312 of them. They had been left behind when the Zorvathi forces retreated. They expected to be killed. In every war the Zorvathi had fought, captured enemies were executed. In every war my people had observed, prisoners were eliminated as a waste of resources." He shook his head slowly. "The humans did not kill them." Cressvan spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. "We know. Many of those soldiers were eventually returned to us. They told us what happened, but we did not believe them. We thought they had been broken by torture and forced to spread lies." "It was not torture," Kethral said. "It was something far stranger." He stood and began to pace again, his movements restless and agitated. The chief medical officer was a woman named Dr. Beth Lawson. She was 41 years old, with red hair turning gray at the edges and hands that never stopped moving. She worked 18-hour shifts, sleeping only when her body collapsed from exhaustion. Kethral stopped in the center of the chamber. Her brother had been a pilot. His ship was destroyed by Zorvathi forces 3 months before I arrived. She watched the recording of his death. She knew exactly which enemy squadron had killed him. He paused to let that sink in. When the Zorvathi prisoners were brought to her hospital, one of them was Commander Vrektal, a high-ranking officer. The commander of the very squadron that had killed her brother. The chamber grew very still. Commander Vrektal had a serious wound in his chest. Without immediate surgery, he would die within hours. Dr. Lawson was the only surgeon available who could perform the operation. Kethral looked at each delegate in turn. She saved his life. She worked for 6 hours to repair the damage to his body. She gave him blood from human donors because Zorvathi blood supplies had run out. She sat by his bed for 2 days afterward, monitoring his recovery. The Korthani delegate made a sound like breaking glass. "That is impossible. No being would save the one who killed their family." "I watched her do it," Kethral replied. When Commander Vrektal woke up and learned who had saved him, he demanded to know why. He screamed at her. He called her weak. He said she should have let him die. The Selvian's voice grew soft. "Do you know what she said to him?" She said, "You are wounded." "That is enough," she said. "My brother would not want me to become a monster to avenge him." She said, "Hate is a poison, and I choose not to drink it." Kethral returned to his chair and sat down heavily. That was not the only example. There was a soldier named Sergeant Amy Vance. She was assigned to manage the Zorvathi prisoners. She was a large woman, strong and intimidating, with a scar across her face from a previous battle. He leaned forward. One night, a group of human soldiers tried to enter the prisoner area. They had lost friends and family to the Zorvathi. They wanted revenge. They wanted to hurt someone, anyone, who wore the enemy uniform. His voice hardened. Sergeant Vance stood in the doorway and refused to let them pass. They beat her. 3 men, attacking her with fists and feet. She did not fight back. She did not call for help. She simply blocked the door with her body until other officers arrived and stopped the attack. Kethral touched his own face, tracing an invisible wound. When I asked her why she did not defend herself, she told me that fighting back would have escalated the situation. She told me that the prisoners were under her protection, and she would die before she let them be harmed. She told me that being human meant protecting those who could not protect themselves, even if those people were enemies. Ambassador Tyrus raised one scaled hand. This is unprecedented. In my species' history, prisoners of war have always been treated as resources or threats, never as beings deserving protection. That is exactly what I thought, Kethral agreed. I could not understand it. I watched human doctors treat enemy wounded with the same care they gave their own soldiers. I watched human guards share their food with prisoners who had killed their friends. I watched soldiers write letters of condolence to the families of enemies they had killed in battle. He spread his 4 hands in a gesture of helplessness. I asked them why. Again and again, I asked them why. They gave me many answers, but they all came down to the same thing. They said that the enemy soldiers were just people. They said that hate destroys the one who carries it. They said that compassion is not weakness, it is strength. Kethral looked at the Zorvathi ambassador. Your people began to break after that, ambassador. Not from torture. Not from fear. From confusion. The captured Zorvathi could not understand why they were being treated with kindness. It went against everything they had been taught about war. Some of them began to share information willingly. Others requested to stay with the humans, rather than be returned to the Empire. Cresisvan's scarred face showed the first sign of emotion. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed. I know, he said quietly. We lost more soldiers to human kindness than to human weapons. Our warriors returned home, changed. They questioned our ways. They asked why we could not be more like our enemies. We thanks to Mart. We thanks for watch. Kethral nodded slowly. That is the madness I spoke of. Human compassion is a weapon more powerful than any gun or bomb. It destroys the will to fight. It breaks apart hatred and leaves something strange in its place. Something like respect. Something like shame. He looked down at his hands. I watched Commander Vrektal weep when Dr. Lawson finally released him. Not from pain. From gratitude. He told her that she had shown him the face of true strength, and he would carry it with him for the rest of his life. The chamber was silent for a long moment. I began to understand something during my time at that hospital, Kethral continued. Humans do not fight because they hate their enemies. They fight because they love what they protect, and when the fighting is done, they extend that love even to those who tried to destroy them. He looked up at the assembly with haunted eyes. Is that not terrifying? Is that not the most frightening thing you have ever heard? An enemy who defeats you and then weeps for your fallen. An enemy who captures you and then heals your wounds. An enemy who has every reason to hate you and chooses compassion instead. Kethral shuddered. I saw human endurance at Carrion 4. I saw human compassion at Vega 7. But I had not yet seen the fullness of human sacrifice. That came later. At the Battle of the Kessler Nebula. He paused. That is where I truly understood what humans are capable of. That is where I watched good people choose death for strangers they would never meet. The delegates shifted uncomfortably. If what they had heard so far was unsettling, the worst was clearly yet to come. Kethral prepared to tell them about the darkest day of his life. He sat back down in his chair. That was only the beginning, he said quietly. The siege of Carrion 4 showed me human endurance. What came next showed me something even more disturbing. It showed me human compassion. The delegates exchanged nervous glances. If what they had heard so far was disturbing, what could possibly be worse? They were about to find out. Kethral stood silent for a long moment. His body trembled, and his gray skin had turned almost white. The memories of what came next were the worst of all. They were the ones that woke him screaming in the night. "The Battle of the Kessler Nebula," he finally said. "The turning point of the war. The day that everything changed." He walked slowly to the center of the chamber. I was aboard a Selvian observation vessel, keeping our required distance from the combat zone. We had been tracking a human convoy for 3 days. 40 transport ships, carrying refugees from the outer colonies, men, women, and children. Nearly 40,000 civilians total. His voice grew heavy. The convoy was being escorted by 63 human warships. It was supposed to be a simple journey through safe space. But the Zorvathi had been planning something. They had gathered their largest fleet in secret, hiding in the dust clouds of the nebula. Kethrol turned to face the Zorvathi ambassador. 212 warships, Ambassador. You brought 212 warships against 63 escorts, and 40 unarmed transports full of families. Kresvan met his gaze without flinching. It was war. We saw an opportunity to end the conflict quickly. By slaughtering civilians? Kethrol asked, his voice rising. By destroying ships full of children? That is what war is, Kresvan replied coldly. The weak are destroyed so that the strong may survive. Kethrol stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned back to the assembly. The human fleet was commanded by Admiral Laura Kent, the same woman who had welcomed me aboard the Defiant Hope all those months ago. When the Zorvathi fleet appeared, she had only seconds to make a decision. He began to pace again, his movements sharp and agitated. She ordered a tactical withdrawal. The escorts would form a defensive line, while the transports jumped to safety. It was the logical choice. The only choice, but several of her captains refused the order. Kethrol stopped. They refused to retreat. They said they would stay and buy more time. They knew they would die. They chose to die anyway. The chamber was completely silent. There was a destroyer called the Burning Dawn. It was an old ship, scheduled for retirement after the war. Its captain was a man named Nick Palmer. He was 52 years old. He had served in the fleet for 30 years. He had a wife named Maria and 3 grown children. Kethral's voice began to shake. When Admiral Kent ordered the withdrawal, Captain Palmer moved his ship to the front of the formation. He positioned the Burning Dawn directly between the Zorvathi fleet and 3 transport vessels that were having engine problems. Those transports could not jump. They could not escape. Without protection, they would be destroyed. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Captain Palmer opened a channel to his crew. Every deck, every station could hear him. I have the recording. I have listened to it hundreds of times. I still do not understand it. I from stay. Kethral's voice dropped to a whisper. He said, "This is the captain. By now you all know the situation. The transports behind us cannot jump. If we leave, they die. 14,000 people, including 4,000 children." He paused. Then he said, "Anyone who wants to leave, the escape pods are open. I will not order anyone to stay. I will not judge anyone who goes. But I am staying. For those of you who choose to stay with me, it has been the greatest honor of my life to serve beside you." Tears ran openly down Kethral's face. Not a single crew member left. Not one. 347 humans, and every single one of them chose to stay and die so that strangers could live. The Velish ambassador made a soft sound of distress. The Korthani delegate had gone completely still. The battle lasted 47 minutes. The Burning Dawn absorbed 17 direct hits. I watched from my observation vessel as pieces of the ship broke away into space. I watched explosions bloom across its hull. I watched it burn. Kethral's voice cracked, and still they fought. With half their weapons destroyed, and fires raging through the corridors, they kept fighting. Chief Engineer Ryan Marsh sealed himself in the engine room when it began to flood with radiation. He kept the engines running for another 12 minutes while the poison ate him alive. Lieutenant Chris Dunn stayed at his navigation post even after a hull breach tore the bridge apart around him. He used his dying breath to plot one final course. Kethral fell silent for a moment, struggling to compose himself. In the end, Captain Palmer did something no one expected. With his ship breaking apart around him, he accelerated directly toward the largest Zorvathi cruiser. He rammed it. The Burning Dawn and the enemy cruiser were both destroyed in the collision. He looked at Cressvan. That cruiser was your flagship, Ambassador. The command ship of the entire fleet. Its destruction threw your forces into chaos long enough for the transports to escape. Cressvan said nothing. His face was like stone. 14,000 civilians survived because of the Burning Dawn. 4,000 of them were children. Not a single member of Captain Palmer's crew lived to see it. Kethrol walked slowly back to his chair and collapsed into it. I have studied war for my entire life. I have observed species across the galaxy destroy each other in every way imaginable. But I have never seen anything like what I witnessed that day. I have never seen beings choose certain death for strangers they would never meet. He looked at Commander Harris, who still stood silently in the corner. The human officer's face showed no expression, but his eyes were bright, with something Kethral could not name. I spent weeks trying to understand it, Kethral continued. I analyzed their communications, their personal logs, their final messages to their families. Do you know what I found? Not a single one of them expressed regret. Not one. They were afraid. Yes. They knew they were going to die, but they were at peace with it. He shook his head in wonder. Captain Palmer's last message to his wife was recorded just minutes before the end. He told her that he loved her. He told her not to be sad. He told her that if he had the choice to do it again, he would make the same decision. He said, "Some things are worth dying for. Those children are worth dying for. Our future is worth dying for. You are worth dying for." Kethral's voice broke completely. How do you fight an enemy like that? How do you defeat a species that considers death a fair price for protecting the innocent? How do you win against people who love so deeply that they would burn themselves alive rather than let strangers come to harm? He looked around at the assembled delegates. The Battle of the Kessler Nebula was called a human victory because the convoy escaped, but the humans lost 31 ships that day. Over 8,000 soldiers died. They did not celebrate their victory. They mourned their dead. They built memorials and whispered the names of the fallen. Kethral straightened in his chair. That night, Admiral Kent addressed her remaining fleet. She wept openly as she spoke. She called the crew of the Burning Dawn heroes. But then she said something that has haunted me ever since. She said, "Do not forget that our enemies have families too. Do not let their sacrifice fill you with hate. Honor them by being worthy of their gift. Honor them by ending this war with mercy." He spread his hands. Mercy. After everything the Zorvathi had done, after the ambush that killed 8,000 of her people, she called for mercy. Kethral looked at the tribunal with exhausted eyes. That is humanity. Endurance beyond reason. Compassion beyond understanding. Sacrifice beyond measure. And through it all, a stubborn insistence on love that defies every logic I have ever known. He slumped back in his chair. I have one more piece of testimony, the conclusion. The end of the war, and the truth that the galaxy must understand. Ambassador Tyrus nodded slowly, clearly shaken by what he had heard. Continue, he said quietly. Tell us how this ends. The tribunal chamber felt smaller now. The weight of Kethral's testimony pressed down on every delegate like a physical force. Hours had passed since the Selvian had begun his account, and the assembly had heard things that challenged everything they believed about war and the nature of civilized species. Kethral sat in silence for a long moment, gathering his strength for the final part of his testimony. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. The war ended 4 months after the Battle of the Kessler Nebula. The Zorvathi Empire surrendered unconditionally. He looked at Ambassador Cressvan. But you did not surrender because you were defeated militarily. You could have fought for years longer. You had the ships, the soldiers, the resources. Cressvan remained silent, his scarred face unreadable. You surrendered because your warriors stopped fighting. They refused to engage human forces. They abandoned their posts. They threw down their weapons and waited to be captured. Kethral leaned forward. Tell them why. Ambassador. Tell this tribunal why the great Zorvathi Empire fell apart from within. For a long moment, Cresvan did not move. Then, slowly, he stood. His massive body cast a shadow across the chamber floor. My people are warriors, he said. We have been warriors for 10,000 years. We conquered 60 worlds because we were strong, and our enemies were weak. We did not understand mercy. We did not practice compassion. We believed that kindness was a flaw, that love was a weakness. He turned to face the assembly. Then we fought the humans, and we discovered that everything we believed was wrong. His deep voice echoed through the chamber. Our soldiers returned from human captivity changed. They told stories we did not believe. Stories of doctors who healed them, guards who protected them, enemies who wept for them. We called them liars. We called them cowards. We said they had been broken by torture. Cresvan shook his head slowly. But more soldiers came back with the same stories. Hundreds of them. Thousands. They had not been tortured. They had been shown kindness, and that kindness destroyed them more completely than any weapon could have. He looked down at his hands, massive and scarred from decades of war. Our young warriors began asking questions. Why did we fight? What were we protecting? What was the point of an empire built on death and suffering? They looked at the humans and saw something we could not offer. Purpose. Meaning. Love. Cresvan's voice dropped. By the end, our own soldiers were surrendering to human forces on purpose. They wanted to be captured. They wanted to experience the mercy they had heard about. The Zorvathi Empire did not fall to human guns. It fell to human hearts. He sat back down heavily. That is why we surrendered. Not because we could not fight. Because our people no longer wanted to. The chamber was silent as the delegates absorbed this truth. Kethral stood one final time. He walked to the center of the chamber and turned in a slow circle, meeting the eyes of every ambassador, every diplomat, every representative of the galactic community. I came here to give testimony about the human battlefront. I have told you about their endurance, their compassion, and their sacrifice. Now, I must give you my conclusion. My warning. He stopped turning and faced Ambassador Tyrus directly. Do not make enemies of humanity. His voice grew stronger. Not because they will destroy you. They are capable of that. Yes. Their warriors are relentless. Their determination is beyond measure. They will fight until their bodies break and their blood runs dry, and even then they will keep fighting. Kethral shook his head. But that is not why you should fear them. You should fear them because of what fighting them will do to you. You should fear them because of what you will become in the attempt to match them. He spread his forearms wide. The Zorvathi tried to defeat humanity through cruelty. They answered human mercy with greater violence. They met human compassion with increased brutality, and with every atrocity they committed, they lost more of their own people. Not to death, but to doubt, to shame, to the growing realization that they were the villains in their own story. Kethral's voice rose. Humanity did not conquer the Zorvathi. They transformed them. They held up a mirror and showed them what they had become. And the Zorvathi could not bear to look at their own reflection. He lowered his arms. That is the true power of humanity. They do not destroy their enemies. They convert them. They make you question everything you believe. They make you want to be better than you are. Kethral walked slowly toward Commander Harris, who had remained silent throughout the entire testimony. The human officer watched him approach with calm, steady eyes. I have spent months trying to understand your species, Commander. I have analyzed your history, your culture, your biology. I have searched for the source of your strength, the origin of your impossible compassion. He stopped directly in front of Harris. I still do not understand. I am not sure I ever will. But I know one thing. With absolute certainty. Kethral turned to face the assembly one last time. Humanity is not like us. They are not like any species in this galaxy. They love too deeply, feel too strongly, care too much. By every measure of logic and reason, these should be weaknesses. They should make humans easy to defeat. He shook his head slowly. But they do not. Instead, these traits make humanity something new. Something the galaxy has never seen before. They make humanity dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with weapons or armies. Ambassador Tyrus leaned forward. What do you suggest we do with this information? Observer, Kethril considered the question carefully. Welcome them, he said finally. Accept them as partners and allies. Learn from them if you can. But never, ever threaten what they love, because I have seen what humans do when they are protecting their families, their friends, their future. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. They become monsters of mercy. They become angels of destruction. They become the most terrifying force in the universe, not because they hate, but because they love. Commander Harris finally moved. He uncrossed his arms and stepped forward until he stood beside Kethril in the center of the chamber. May I speak? He asked, his voice quiet and respectful. Ambassador Tyrus nodded. Harris looked around at the gathered delegates. His face was weathered and tired, the face of a soldier who had seen too much death. But his eyes were gentle. The observer has shared his perspective on humanity. He has called us terrifying. He has called us dangerous. He is not wrong. Harris paused. But I want to offer a different view. We do not fight because we enjoy it. We do not sacrifice ourselves because we want to die. We do these things because we have decided that some things matter more than our own survival. He placed one hand over his heart. We believe that every life has value. We believe that mercy is stronger than hatred. We believe that love is the only force worth fighting for. These beliefs make us dangerous to those who threaten innocent lives, but they also make us the best friends you could ever have. Harris looked at Kethril with something like warmth. You are right to warn them, observer. But also tell them this. Humanity would rather die than harm an innocent. We would rather suffer than cause suffering. We would rather lose everything than become the monsters we fight against. He turned back to the assembly. That is who we are. That is what we offer the galaxy. Not conquest. Not domination. Just a hand extended in friendship and a promise to stand beside you against the darkness. Harris stepped back into his corner, and silence filled the chamber. Kethril looked at the gathered delegates one final time. I went to observe humanity's destruction, he said quietly. Instead, I witnessed something else entirely. I witnessed the galaxy's salvation. I witnessed a species that fights its hardest for what it loves. He bowed his head. And I am still afraid. But for the first time, I am also hopeful. The tribunal was concluded. The delegates departed in silence, each carrying with them the weight of what they had heard. The nightmares of the human battlefront had been exposed, and the galaxy would never be the same. Kethril took a deep breath. It ends, he said, with a warning. The nightmares of the human battlefront had only begun.